I am pleased today to welcome Rob Rosner, who I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. Some of you know, many of you know him, some of you don't, and of course everybody knows Tony. So we're going to talk about P3s. Rutgers and P3 projects, perfect together, and I'm not going to do that old Tom Kane accent. So I want to thank Alana Saltzman. This is a continuing part of the PD&D seminar series. So Alana had this great idea years ago now to, hey, there's stuff out there, let's talk about it. So it can be something as straightforward as a lunch and learn, maybe talking about window tints, to interactive. So maybe about a year ago, Alana, we had a barrier-free consultant actually bring in wheelchairs, bring in motorized scooters, bring in barriers, and some folks here sat in them and tried to navigate like a person in a wheelchair does. I think that was incredibly insightful. And this is a continuation of that series. Why talk about P3s? Couple reasons. One, Rutgers has a long history of P3s. Two, I think we're a leader among our Big Ten peers. When I talk to my peers in the Big Ten, nobody does it to the extent that Rutgers does. And I would say nobody does it as well as Rutgers does. I think they're here to stay. It's one of the things we're going to talk about today. I think P3 is going to continue in the future. And I want to talk about them because I think P3s are confusing to some and frustrate some, right? I've heard criticisms, we shouldn't be doing it like this, right? It's not a normal project. It's not, but I would offer that there's a significant benefit to the university, and maybe if you step back and look at the benefit to the university, there's a greater appreciation of P3s. I want to welcome back our esteemed counselor, Rob Rosner, Associate Vice President and Deputy General Counsel. And for those of you that don't know Rob, you may not have seen him when he was here last sitting in front of the cameras. He had this fantastic talk on the Rutgers 56 Act and the legal things that make us who we are. And that's up on YouTube, thanks to Paul G. So if you're interested, it is worth your while, if you haven't seen that, to see Rob talk about the 56 Act and the Peluso case. And then I'll end the welcome slide with a plug for future sessions. This session is here because somebody asked for it, right? So we were out on one of our Places and Faces tours, and somebody said, I was saying, yeah, this is a P3, and NBPAC's a P3. So we said, well, what's a P3? And he had questions, and he said, well, this should be one of our presentations. So if these suggestions don't come to me, I'm going to run out of ideas, so please keep them coming. What's a P3? So in its simplest term, it means historically public-private partnership. 3 Ps, it's that simple. It's changed over time. Right now, we are in the midst of a P4, where there's no privates. P3, no, sorry, public, right? University Hospital, New Jersey Economic Development Authority, and Rutgers. It's a P3, but it's public, and I guess if you add partnership, it's a P4. So P3 means public-private partnership. I will tell you that there's definitions out there that you could Google, like I did, ask AI, and you'll come up with boring, routine definitions. Rutgers expands the depth and breadth, the interpretation. Rob, I know you have a comment here.
Yeah, I just want, if you look at this bottom definition here, it says the National Council for Public-Private Partnerships defines a P3 or a public-private partnership as, now read this carefully, a contractual agreement between a public agency, in our case Rutgers, or federal, state, or local, and a private sector entity, period. Through this arrangement, the skills and assets of each sector, the public and the private, are shared in delivering a service or facility for the use of the general public. Doesn't that sound like any vendor contract? Doesn't that sound like any construction contract? I mean, we're in a contract with a construction manager when we build our design bid builds. So it's sort of an almost useless definition in a way. I think though what's missing is, and I would add to the definition, is that it's really sort of a longer term partnership. When you do a vendor contract, you hire the vendor in the case of a construction manager, they build your project, they hand you the keys, hopefully you have the CO, and you're on your way. You have it from then on. And you've paid for it, they're just providing a service. And so it's a short-term arrangement. And so a P3 is sort of a longer, you think of them as much longer term partnerships in a way. And so that's sort of a key difference between this very basic definition and sort of what a P3 is all about. So we'll get into more of it. But
And
I
I
just
think-
thought that was a funny definition, because like that's any contract, that's anything.
And I think what Tony's going to say as part of his conversation is also involves somebody bringing to the table what Rutgers can't, and that's an important part of it. I talked about that, and I will say that from P3s range from everything to something pretty straightforward to something extraordinarily complex and privatized. So at the farthest end of the spectrum is privatization, it's P3. So if you looked at Ohio State, they've privatized their parking system. They privatized their utility system. So they made a bunch of money. $1 billion, Tony, right, on the parking? $1 billion up front. And there's a long-term deal. I think maybe now that they're a few years into it, there are some that are scratching their heads and saying, is it worth it, right? I don't know the answer to that, but one extreme, which Rutgers has looked at, but doesn't work for us, is privatization. Rutgers P3 fun facts, study these. That's all you need to know when you walk away from this. So, we have $0 budgeted in an annual capital budget. So our operating budget's $5.6 billion. There's zero in a separate budget for capital. So we hunt or fish for capital funds to do projects on an individual basis typically. There's no separate capital budget. So if there's $0, maybe P3s are a way to do it. OPM, I know many in PD&D know the answer to this. What's the best kind of money to spend? Other people's money. That's right. That's the best type of capital dollars to spend.
Just a quick note on that, too. When I first started at Rutgers, I had worked at a firm before that for about 6 years or so, right in New Brunswick. And one of our clients actually was two young brothers from New York City, and then they would do these private housing that you see popping up all over New Brunswick. And they wanted to get into a partnership because I would work with them there, and they knew I was coming to Rutgers. And they said, "Why is Rutgers spending money on dorms?" And it was a good question. Like, you know, we're the private sector's happy to bring money to the table and build dorms, and they're doing it anyway, all around New Brunswick, much smaller scale. And you know, this is a perfect example of other people's money, and then we could use those dollars for our core mission, things like new labs or, you know, other types of infrastructure projects. So it's a good question. One answer to that, and you I think alluded to it a second ago, was when you do have the private sector come in, especially in a housing context, that's what we call the auxiliaries. There's revenue that's generated from just owning that, and so if they pay for it, they're going to take all the revenue from it, and so we get none of the upside. So that's sort of one way of looking at it. What does it make sense to put some money into it and then or take all of the upside, to partner with somebody and share the upside, or have the private sector do it all together?
And it's still on our book.
Right.
So they go out, they borrow the money. They don't have the money in cash. They borrow the money. They paid the money down, but the rating agencies still see that as a Rutgers borrowing, even though Rutgers did not physically borrow it, because if it's in our campus, on the Bush campus, and it goes bust, really, who's backstopping that? We have to backstop it. So it doesn't help us. We can borrow money cheaper than they can borrow money, and we do. So we have over $2 billion in debt right now that Rutgers carries. So we could borrow it cheaper than they can. And if it's still on our book, and if they're taking the money, then what's the point? And then I'm going to get into some tax credit issues in a little while too that will show you even more so why it's beneficial for us to own and operate our own housing system.
1945, a fun fact, like tongue-in-cheek answer, maybe it's our first P3. What happened in 1945? Rutgers was a private institution, and we signed up for a long-term agreement, a partnership with the state to become the State University of New Jersey. So 1945, maybe our first P3. Typically 2 to 4 partners in a P3 project at Rutgers, which maybe makes it a P4. We've done about 24 of these over the years, over the decades. And there's 24 ways those P3s have been done. So I asked Rob, can you give me a standard form of agreement for a P3 project? And he looks at me and laughs, right? No, everyone is on its own, part of the complexity. We spent about $2 billion over the decades. Recent experience, We paid 32 cents on the dollar for H2 at Helix. 32 cents on the dollar. So it's a $750 million building. We're 567 million in, and we are paying 32 cents on the dollar. I thought when Tony presented that to our board through the F&F, I thought I'd never see a number better than that. Well, we're looking at a new project today, as of yet not named, where we might get 28 cents on the dollar. And up in Newark, just approved by our board, working with that P4 project, University Hospital, NJEDA, and Rutgers. Rutgers is paying 9.2 cents on the dollar. 9.2. You can't afford to not do projects when they look at it like this. So Rutgers is cash strapped, right? Everybody's heard me say this, but we're not foolish. So when you're paying 9.2 cents on the dollar for a new building, it's hard to say no. Why a P3? And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Tony, right? Somebody brings something. They bring financial benefits. Maybe they bring speed of delivery. Maybe they bring land acquisition because eminent domain comes with stigma. Maybe there's a programmatic benefit. And here's where Tony has probably 15, 20 years of experience on this. So as I've learned not to try to box Tony into an agenda. So there's the points we want to cover, and I'm going to sit.
Yeah, I'm not good with that. So we've been doing P3s. Let me step back. Definition of P3, right? It really comes down to how do you want to define a P3? So for me, a P3 is who brings what to the table that typically we cannot access. There has to be some other vehicle to access it. So for many years, the law's changed now. For many years, we could not access tax credits. Well, if we can't access them, we have to use a separate vehicle to get to the tax credits, to do the sale. That vehicle is going to want their piece of this, which is completely understandable, right? They should. They're doing the work. And at the time, it could not be another governmental type entity. It had to be a private sector entity. So that's where the public-private piece of this all comes into play. We have entered into P3s because, as Dave has pointed out, because there may be a piece of property that we want and we just can't access because it may be owned by a third party, or maybe it may be owned by a fourth party. So I became a vice president for facilities in 2006. And the first deal that I worked on was something called the hole in the donut. Does anybody know what that is on College Avenue? The hole in the donut? Seminary. So for those of you that have been around for a while, the actual seminary looked like an inverted Dixie cup on Bishop, exactly now where the academic building is, right about there. And the seminary was in deep doo-doo. They were running out of money. They just had to do something because, seminaries, unfortunately, it's difficult for them to stay in business. So I met with them on a number of occasions, and we could not get to the dollar amount that they were looking for. They were looking for really an endowment that would last them for an eternity, that they'd be able to draw off of. We were not in a position to be able to do that, but we didn't give up, because here's something else. Some of these things take years and years and years and years to happen. So, we continue to pursue the hole in the donut because it would complete our campus. That really is what would make it happen. And if you think today to the academic buildings, East and West, you think to the Honors College, and we could throw in the Yard for good measure. All of that started there. In 2006, started with that idea. In addition to that, Hillel, up on College Avenue, and the new seminary across the street from Hillel, basically on College Avenue as well. All those properties. So we couldn't access it. It was pretty much impossible. Started to have some conversations with Chris Palladino from DevCo. And he happened to be on a board. It's funny how, 6 degrees of separation. happened to be named onto some task force that a gentleman named John Hanson, none of this is a secret. John Hanson, who's very big in real estate in the state of New Jersey, was also the chairperson of this task force, and it was just under Chris Christie at the time when he got elected. So, John Hanson also was the president of the seminary. And they were having conversations, much separate from conversations we're having. And I'm talking to Chris on the other side and trying to figure out what could we do here. Fortuitously, at the same time, Chris Christie decided to float an enormous bond issue, about $1.5 billion, 3 different buckets of bonds. Some of them were outright grants. Some of this was you would have to pay some of the debt service, not all of the debt service, all those good things. The one thing it didn't apply to were auxiliaries, which meant you could not build housing, student centers, rec centers, stadiums, anything like that with this. It had to be purely academic type of buildings. So Chris lands a deal with Greg Mast, who was the head of the seminary at the time, and we're brought into that deal. We were gonna.
Do you want to know do we have time for a quick side story?
Sure.
On to why we were brought into that deal? I don't know if you actually know this part, but this is a little funny story. That's kind of it's an act of volunteerism that got Rutgers back into the game. So I actually, one night, I was volunteering at the homeless shelter run by the First Reformed Church. You just, they just need people to come and sleep there. And another volunteer was from the seminary, and it was at the time when our discussions were sort of really stretched, and we were almost ready to walk away. And this guy told me, a professor at the seminary, he said, we're talking with Chris, we're moving forward, like with or without you. And he was like, they were pretty close to having a deal done without Rutgers involved. And I was like, oh, interesting, neat. The next day I went to, at the time, John Aldred said, we have to get back involved in this deal because we cannot let a third party operate housing or whatever they're going to do in the middle of our campus in the donut hall without us being involved.
Right.
I was like, so it was volunteerism that
I did know because there was a lot of bluster by our friend too. So anyway, we swing the deal, and there were a couple of things that happened. We wind up with the property that we wanted, right there, smack. We wind up with the seminary property, but it came at a cost. We developed the seminary property. The Honors College next door also, at the time, there was something called Transit City tax credits. Transit City, Transit Hub tax credits. Had to be within half a mile of the train station. You know what's exactly half a mile from the train station? The Honors College. So we put up the Honors College. We get tens of millions at the time in tax credits from that. Because our housing is pretty self-sufficient, we're able to take that $2 million a year in tax credits and put it towards the debt service for the academic buildings. And at the same time, we wind up trading property because Hillel was where the Honors College is. That was their property. So we traded that property for the property on College Avenue with them. They got a few bucks out of the deal as well. So it was Hillel, it was Devco, it was the seminary, it was us. Was there another fifth partner in this? No, that's a different deal. Yeah, they really don't like to deal with us. I think the fraternity was, so it was at least 4 partners in that deal. And at the end of the day, I don't think that deal probably cost us 50 cents on the dollar when we were all said and done. It was a couple of hundred millions of dollars to put all of that up. So my definition of a P3 is, what do we wind up with that's leveraged that we could not get before? And it could be a piece of property, Jess, that we want. And sometimes the best way to get that piece of property is you have to enter into a deal that helps us to get there as we move on, as we move our way down. Tax credits have financed the View. By financing the View, they pretty much paid for Barnes & Noble, the bookstore. We never really had a flagship bookstore until Barnes and Noble. And again, we never really thought that bookstores would kind of poop themselves over time, but it's what's happened, and unfortunately, it's what's happened. But it was the anchor. If you think about looking down College Ave, and there is that clock and that bookstore, and it is just beautiful. And we've worked for years, decades now, on what happens where the old Rutgers Club is, because that's the two anchors. What do we put on that end that then kind of anchor College Avenue as a real college campus in the middle of a city? So again, you can look at P3s in many, many different ways, but I think, to me, the way to look at them is really trying to access something you can never access, use a vehicle you could never use. We did all that solar on Livingston. By the way, I'm thinking about it, you were involved in every one of these, weren't you? So we did all that solar in Livingston, and again, these were federal 1601 grant, right? Federal tax grants that accelerated depreciation, all things that meant nothing to us. We don't pay taxes. Means nothing to us. But we were able to offload that with a third party who wound up financing what we were doing. And at one point, there was actually a negative return. In other words, we borrowed about $37 million to do that job. What people tend to forget is we did all the parking lots. So when Livingston was put up, when the rack was put up in a big rush, and it was put up so that the Nets, right? The Nets could play here because they were homeless. So it was put up, and it was a rush, like, get this thing up quick now. And it was never meant for them to be here forever. So they took all that property, and I don't know, John, would they put 4 inches of blacktop, I think it was, literally, compacted, and that's how those parking lots were from that time that the rack went up until it was redone. So we had to redo all those parking lots, like really redo them, because they wouldn't be able to support anything. And they were, for those of you that may have been around when the solar was put up, they were in terrible shape. Huge potholes. I mean, you couldn't even drive through Livingston. It was so bad. And again, there was nothing on Livingston. There'd be pretty much no reason for you to drive to Livingston, but that's a different story. So when we did that job, we wound up paying something like, it returned something like negative 10 cents, which meant that we were actually making money after debt service, after everything else, after the electric. We were calling all of that on that project. So those are the types of things for me when we look at P3s, and we've done them everywhere. We've done them on all the campuses, and we really took off with these after 2006. There are some, we talk about P3s, and we can technically call them a P3. I think a little bit more like Rob says. So, look, we didn't build Rockoff Hall. We entered into an agreement with Rockoff Hall. We entered into an agreement with the public safety building. Some projects you do because you need to do. Some projects you do because you want to be a good neighbor. So, we entered into public safety because the city was really looking to improve the corridor between Cook Douglas and College Avenue. And so the way to really improve that corridor was, let's put a police station in the middle of it, and that should help. And it did, and it was in pretty bad shape at the time. But, we wound up with a building, but not for free. We paid our share. There were some grants and some types of things that went in there. So, but we wound up with a building, and we certainly didn't own that land. That land wound up coming to us. So that's part of where the quid pro quo lands. Rockoff was also done in a way to try and stabilize that area. You'll notice we don't own anything in Rockoff. We also did not put money into Rockoff. What we did at Rockoff was agree to take 5 or 6 floors, something like that, maybe, give or take. I don't even know if it was the whole building at the time. It may not have been. Yeah, a guarantee for X amount of years. We were the tenants. As soon as we could get out, we did. it didn't work for us as a dorm. It was tough for bus stop. Everything about Rockoff just did not work well for us. So as soon as we could, we got out of it. But we will pretty much partner with the devil if necessary, if that means they're going to put some money in our pockets. I'll tell you who, the only one time ever that we walked away from a deal that included federal historic tax credits. And that was for 15 Washington up in Newark. Now, we did have tax credits for 15 Washington. We had some state money by way of the bond issue, I believe, for 15 Washington. So we had pretty good, but we also were awarded federal tax credits. And it was about $15 million. And we decided to walk away, actually the developer that we were working with, because very narrow interpretation of how federal tax credits work, the historic tax credits. So the one place they don't benefit is another governmental entity. They have to benefit the private sector. You know, could we say that our auxiliary is the private sector because we're renting housing and that's what it was? I don't know. It was one of those things where sometimes instead of having a 10-year headache and nobody to pardon us, better that we just get out of it and walk away from it. So that was the one time where we did that. But most of what we've gotten really kind of sits up here, I think. Financial benefit from all of the deals that you've seen, and we've done a lot of them, and I know Dave's going to show a list later on of what those look like, and they take lots of different iterations. Sometimes we give up this property for X amount of years because of tax credits that are involved. The laws surrounding some of these tax credits have changed, so now we are able to access them, but maybe we don't own that land, and that's another way that we've had to get involved when it comes to partnering with outside entities. So if you look at, for instance, the Helix started as, by the way, the Helix started well before Phil Murphy. And that idea had been kicked around for some time as to what to do there. I will tell you that New Brunswick and New Brunswick Development Corporation looked at probably 5 or 6 or 7 different iterations for what would go there. Again, for those of you that don't know, what was there was a parking deck in our bookstore. That's where our bookstore was, where the Helix is now. So, you know, we were asked to vacate. And by the way, that was also a partnership we got into in order for them to be able to build that deck and clean that area up. And so we left. We were asked to vacate, which was fine, and later put up Barnes & Noble. But after we got out, there was probably about 5 to 8 different iterations. I can tell you probably 3 right off the top of my head. One was HQ2. For those of you that may remember, HQ2 was that big second headquarters for Amazon, right? They were going to put another headquarters on this side of the country. And, you know, they really played this one well. Thank you, Jeff Bezos. And what they did was they had this competition going on amongst all kinds of cities that were, you know, in the mix, and everybody was trying their best to land the Jeff Bezos HQ2 that was considered, you know, going to really revitalize whatever city it might have gone into. It was the second coming. It was just phenomenal what was going to happen with this. And it almost did. It almost. So it was awarded to Arlington, Virginia. And for those of you that may remember. And then the pandemic hit and nobody was there. So much for that. So anyway, that was one that was planned. We put together plans. We worked with New Brunswick Development Corporation. We worked with the city. We put together plans. We did all kinds of stuff that, you know, what we would offer, what we could bring to the table. That was one. There were a couple of, and I don't want to really name the companies, BlackRock and some other companies that were looking to put their headquarters here as well, and those really did not pan out. And then Phil Murphy was elected, and so this had been going on, and we had, looking at incubator space, looking at space for startups, for innovation hub. And for those of you that may remember, it was actually called the Hub first go around before it was called the Helix. And so Phil Murphy decided that he wanted to transform the economy of New Jersey into more of an innovation economy, which is fine. And so that started to grow from there. What really took off was, we thought if you're going to put up a building, you want to put up a big building. You don't want to put up a little building in the city, right, Bob? You don't want to put like 3 floors of a building. You want this high rise minimally to put up there. And we started thinking, well, what could we do that maybe works here, but we have no money? So we applied for tax credits because we love tax credits. How much did we get there? 200 million? 271 in tax credits? 271 million in tax credits plus 300 million as an appropriation from the state of New Jersey. The governor sent. How can you say no? Sure, we'll build it. Why not? We love it. So we continue to look to expand on what we could do. And then we continue to look at, it doesn't hurt us when somebody else actually builds it for us. Those of you on the project side know that you work side by side with whomever that developer might be. So we're still there. We're still sitting alongside of it. We still have fights with them like we do with the contractors. That doesn't really change. So all the same stressors happen. The only difference is that somebody else is responsible through construction versus us being, but at the end of the day, we're still responsible, so it doesn't matter. I look at it like we're putting these up anyway. Doesn't really matter if it's a developer that's doing it. Their procurement policies are potentially a little different than ours. That might make a difference, but, and as for speed, there's an argument as to whether they're quicker or not quicker. I actually don't think, I think the project takes the time that a project takes. And that's given all the variables that might fall into the project. So I don't know that I subscribe to, it's quicker. I've heard that. I've heard that a lot. So there are companies, especially in housing, that Dave talked about, where it's like, well, we'll put this up, we'll borrow the money, we'll put this up, we'll do it all. And, a crappy product is a crappy product. So it all comes to the design, right? So they design a crappy product. We don't design really crappy products. We might have to do lots of machinations. We may have to give into certain things depending on what the market forces tell us, but we don't start off designing a crappy product. I could take you to a bunch of capstone projects that, I'm not even sure there's sheetrock between on those walls. So they're built that way, right? They're built at minimal cost. And so you pay what you pay. One thing we've never sacrificed was the design of our buildings as we get into building them. We may make some changes, we may make some exceptions, but we do that when we do it when we're doing it ourselves as well. So, and programmatic benefit really comes down to, here's the other thing. Because there is an ability sometimes to have a private-public partnership, doesn't mean you need to take advantage of it. If you're going to put up housing and it's going to be really cheap, but you have no demand for the housing, then what's the point? Unless you have a real plan for what you're doing, I've said, and I continue to say, and I will always say, facilities follows program. It really comes down to what the university is doing, and what we do is fill the holes for what they're doing. not enough money to do it. That's where we need to think out of the box, right? That's part of my job, is try and figure that out. But they have to tell us what they want, whether it's lab buildings or just like the Helix. So we have a medical school going in there, program. It's all about bringing together the medical school in New Brunswick. When it was built here in the 60s, it was built, first year students would never see a patient. Let me give you this, especially for you older guys, Chris. First year students are in a hospital now seeing you. So that would never happen before. I mean, the collaboration now, all of that, very different than it was in the 60s. So think about this. We're teaching to 60s. We're not even teaching to 2000. Never mind 2025, right? We're teaching to 60s, 1960s. So program. And then the second piece is all about research. And make no mistake, especially today's environment, what we hear on the news, what some of the insanity going around surrounding research, make no mistake that it is probably one of the most important things that we do in America. And that's why it's done across America, right? It isn't like Rutgers is the only place that does it. Every university in America. It's almost like the research arms race that goes on. And make no mistake, there's a cost associated to doing it because you don't put up a lab building for free. So yeah, there is F&A, what they call indirect costs. Absolutely. It's not what we read in the press. Unfortunately, that's kind of taken very much out of context. But there is a cost associated. And there's a cost associated with everything. And if we didn't call it F&A and we just said, here's a portion of this grant that gets paid back to the university, people would say, oh, okay, I don't know. So all of that comes into play. And with that, Dave?
So I'm going to go kind of quick through this, challenges of a P3. And this is what Rutgers keeps an eye out for. So the examples I'm going to give you typically are not seen at Rutgers, but I have heard stories among peers. We do see this a little bit. We see reduction in control, right? Because your private partner maybe is bringing more to the table or has influence in design. But I will say that maybe we don't always get what we ask for, but we always get what we need. And that's really important. So is there a little bit of give and take? Absolutely. And there's instances, not at Rutgers, but in other institutions, when P3s go bad, it can go bad. But we work with legal counsel well in advance to make sure that we are guarding our interests. There's a complexity of project management and operations, and Nick and Shai and John will tell you this, right? These are complicated contracts that structure the deal, but then filter down throughout. And in the most complex P3s, maybe Rutgers is operating it, maybe we're not, right? So it's got to be thought through, which we do. Complexity in legal matters, and Rob's going to talk on the next slide, right? These are not your traditional form of agreement that you stick in an RFP, and Rob's going to talk about that in a moment. It's not a silver bullet. I had a meeting last week. I told Tony, somebody was really pushing. They want firm X to come in and build the housing because it's free for us. Why wouldn't we do this? It's free. One, it's not. So back up for a minute. Prevailing wage state, New Jersey. Private developers do not get away from prevailing wage. It's on Rutgers land. The job is at prevailing wage. Sheetrock is sheetrock. So if your labor rates are the same and your materials are the same, and we can borrow money cheaper, and we're not going to charge a profit, how can it work? And the answer is, it doesn't. You're getting sold a line of BS, right? You will hear, it's a silver bullet, it's a silver bullet. It's not.
The only silver bullet is forced.
Right. And then privatization gone wrong. So we've not seen this. I think in New Jersey, privatization is hard to sell, especially under this administration at the state that is that favors the union environment. I don't think we'll see a lot of privatization, but that might be a challenge of a P3. And then moving on to Rob. Rob, I'm going to give you the clicker here, right? All right, I'll do that.
I'll just speak generally. I mean, I guess, again, in my head, the biggest difference between a P3 and the sort of normal way we do it, where we hire a contractor, they build a building, and then we're done, the relationship's over, and we operate it, we maintain it, is, and this is sort of the traditional sort of classic P3 view, is that there is a longer-term relationship for the life of the project after it's built. And so there's usually some relationship with the private party, if coming from the public's perspective, where they're going to either operate it or somehow be involved in the maintenance. And so how you actually structure them can run the gamut. It's not you're not using like a construction contract and then you're done. So whether there's ground leases involved or just master operating leases, that's typically the way it works. Where now we're like for the Helix, we're a tenant, if you will. Like Devco, I say Devco, and the Brunswick Development Corporation is the owner of the project. But we're the long-term tenant, and so our rental income, if you will, pays for the debt service that went into building the building up front. And so that main instrument on how you capture the relationship is critical, and it's usually in this form of a lease. But leases can be negotiated, and all types of provisions are thought about. And one thing you have to think about up front is what happens at the end, because projects, even though they're long-term, they still do have an end, and projects have a lifespan. And so how do you unwind the deal, and whether there's, even when the project's going fine, is there an optional way to get out of the deal? Because I think this was one of the big sticking points in the Helix deal, where I forget what it was, but we wanted the right to take ownership of our spaces, like have fee simple ownership of the property instead of being a tenant. And I can't remember what the issue was, but Devco didn't want that. And I remember a specific fight about, Chris is like, well, it's our building, and I said, well, whose name's at the top of it? Whose money's going into it? You can call it your building, but it's our building too. We're partners, so you don't have complete control here. And so there's a lot of negotiation that goes up into the front end of these P3 deals. So that's just that process alone takes additional time, and there's usually more than just one main instrument. There's a variety of leases, and you have different parties. They're all involved, and are they subtenants and that type of thing. So there's just a lot of legal complexity that goes into it.
Rob, one insertion, if I could.
Yeah.
And specific to the Helix, so Rutgers will operate that building in its entirety, right? And this is something that was thought about during negotiating the deal, because Rutgers will operate the property, even though we're tenants under the research laws. Because we're operating, we can treat it as an owned building and collect the 57% F&A rate, which is cut in half if you operate in leased space. So, I mean, that's part of the complexities of figuring this out.
That's another example of an agreement now we have to negotiate and enter into, as an operating agreement. Like, how does it work? If somebody else in the building has an issue, a maintenance issue, how does it get dealt with? And so, who and what are we being paid for that? Do we have a general fee on top of just the cost? So you have to really think carefully about what the relationship is, who's bringing what, who's doing what, and then documenting that all on contracts that hopefully people understand. The best contracts are the ones that you negotiate up front and then never look at again, because if the relationship goes well, you don't need to look at the contract, and usually that's the way it works. But sometimes you got to pull it out. Well, you agreed to that. We were going to have 10 days notice, and when you're at that stage, it's an ugly situation. But you get through it, and that's why you got to go carefully into the contracts. Another issue to keep in mind is whether the public entity in the P3 deal even has authority to do it. Rutgers, because if you saw my 56 Act conversation, we took the position that because we were a private entity and we retained all our private charter rights, basically like a nonprofit, we could do a P3 if we wanted to. We didn't have to be told by the federal or the state that you're authorized to do P3s. But if you're in most other governmental entities, whether you're a municipality or a state entity or a federal agency, if your enabling statute doesn't expressly allow you to do a P3 deal, you can't do it. And so most states, I think every state in the country now has authorized P3 deals, and whether for the state or whether for state entities or agencies, or even for colleges. And so most people can do them now, but they needed to have express authority so they could enter into them. And those statutes, you got to read those carefully too, to make sure like how you're doing the particular P3 you're going to enter into is also authorized by the statute. So there's just a lot of a lot to keep in mind as you go into them. I guess
So let me piggyback
Yeah.
on what you said about uh, negotiation, the legalities and the negotiating process when you start to do these. I've been doing them now for 20 years, and to me, it's there's always something to learn, and you have to learn something new because the rules change, right? Whether it was at one point tax credits could only be sold by, a third party, not-for-profit entity, or that's now changed, or the feds. The other thing when you're negotiating, and we've gotten a pretty good dose of this. So if you look at the monies at the Helix, the grant, the $300 million, and you look at the monies at the project we're doing up at on behalf of University Hospital and EDA, and you look at those, it's all federal dollars. Federal dollars. The rules are very different than state dollars. And then those rules are even more different than our dollars when we look at, our procurement. So you have to understand how all of those, how the finances within the finances work. And you have to spend a lot of time trying to negotiate and renegotiate and put yourself in a place, because the last thing we need is for the federal government to come back and claw back, because we broke the rules, $100 million. Well, then what? Then all these P3s were for nothing. So we really need to be very, very, very careful. And the detail that comes along with the rules that are associated with the expenditures of federal dollars and state grant dollars, right down to, what are you entitled to by way of a project management fee, all of those things make this that much harder. And remember something, by the way, again, we learn all the time, right? So when we first got the monies for the Helix, we talk grant, grant, grant. I think of grant like you're giving me a gift. That's the way I look at a grant, because I'm not in research. Turns out grant in this instance is just like a research grant. And after I had signed all the paperwork, discovered that, oh shit, I have to send this through the research office, because they practically went, nuts over this. This is a $300 million grant that what are you doing? You can't, this is not for you. Actually goes through the research process, the RAPS process, the whole process that they have in there as a research grant. Not in a million years would I have thought of that. Now, the next set, of course, I know better. First thing I did was bring research in so they could see the terminology, make sure they were good with it, and they can get it in their system. But who knew? I mean, I didn't know this. None of us knew this as we went through this. None of us understood that what I'm thinking, what I define as a grant, and what the feds were defining as a grant were two different things, that completely different. So on top of that, we also have to navigate things like the Office of State Controller. You want to explain how that works? The Office of, or Rob, you can explain how that works.
So there's an Office of the State Comptroller, which was formed like 2008 or so, or 10 maybe. I don't remember when they were exactly formed. But one of their functions is to review anybody in the state who's a state or a governmental instrumentality who spends money over $12 million. If you're doing any project over $12 million, the way you procure the people you're working with has to go through the comptroller. They have to look at that procurement process to make sure it complies with applicable law. And so if you're another state college, there's a state college's contracts law. Because we're Rutgers and we don't have to follow that, they look at our own policies to make sure we're complying with our policies. But if you're like the state highway administration or something, they have their own procurement processes. So the comptroller will look at every procurement that goes out just to make sure that it is complying with the applicable law. And it's a process that takes a long time. You got to build that into your time schedules, and they actually get very detailed. Their aim is to maximize competition. So they'll look at your specs even and make sure that your specs are maximizing competition wherever possible. And there's been examples where they, I mean, you all probably know what the front end of one of our projects look like. It's this thick of specs and paper.
You want to put your hands up
They-
this thing? I get.
This-
Yeah, there you go.
They read through it all, and we've
They
gotten
do.
pushback on things like, well, you're specifying, only Honeywell products for your, controls, and we're like, well, that's because that's what we use, and well, why don't you say, it has to be more competitive than that, and it's just mind blowing that there's somebody in Trenton reading every single spec saying it could be more competitive. But anyway, that's their function, is to make sure you're complying with your procurement standards and maximizing competition to the extent possible. So for these P3 deals, it's a little complex because they're sort of in their own realm. It's not just your standard design bid build, and we're issuing an RFP out on the street. So we're issuing development agreements, or so it's sort of like, well, what are we looking at? And I'm like, well, you tell me. You're the ones who have to look at this. But it's just it's a process that we go through with another level at the state.
And it really is a very detailed process. I mean, we've seen this where they'll come back and say, well, on page 286, you're saying this, which doesn't seem to conform with page 202. And it's like, oh, you got to be kidding me. Even we didn't read that stuff, right? It's like, we're not reading that. So it really is mind-boggling, but and it's a lot of give and take. And to add to that, many times we have to be educating them. That's not on them. That's just because we are doing things here. And you guys should all be proud of this. They're really outside of the box. I mean, this is not stuff that is done typically in the public sector in any way, shape, or form. What we're doing here is way outside of what people normally see. So these are contracts and the type of agreements that Rob negotiates and works on that typically you would only see in the corporate world. You're never going to see that here. And we've brought that in because it's a way for us to get ahead in many ways. I'll tell you that the latest thing we did because of that difference, and so you know this, Susan, well, right? That difference with the feds and the procurement laws and rules, and trying to square that when we were trying to get our RFP out for this project in Newark, it was Christmas Eve. Until like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the fish was already being made, and we were still negotiating this back and forth with them. To give them credit, they were also on the phone and they were responsive on Christmas Eve. So, we have to take the initiative and push this a lot.
Just to give I want to give them a small plug here. I mean, I know they drive me crazy sometimes, but I gave them a phone call right before Thanksgiving and said, hey, we have an extremely important, time-sensitive RFP going out. We're going to get to the RFP as soon as possible. I think we got it to them by the 10th of December. And so by December 10th through Christmas Eve, we worked with, and they reviewed this incredibly complex project, and we got approval Christmas Eve at like 3 in the afternoon or something. But they so
Christmas miracle.
to their credit, they did work with us, and so I want to be thankful for that.
Yeah, because this is being filmed.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, they did a hell of a great job. We really. Yeah. So, but it's true. It was after 3 on Christmas Eve, and it was like, wow, this was the Christmas miracle, because nobody really wanted to come back on the 26th and have to start all over again and do this. So these are complex. These are things that I can attest to. I've gone out. We've done presentations at the invitation of some of our consultants, actually, who say, wow, can you come out and be on a panel and talk about this? And we've done that. We're pretty proud. And I think you have another slide, right?
Yeah, so this presentation will be distributed, so we're not going to go down this line by line. Rutgers inherited some P3s from UMDNJ in history. And again, there's a broad definition here. We don't always get something built. So Tony, at NBPAC, we get what's called lit time, right, or stage time through a P3. John, we're getting power, right, through P3. Right. Our program is in the Rutgers Cancer Institute, right? So it's not There's, again, 24 plus P3s, 24 plus ways it's been done. So we do have time for questions, and I hope you have some, because really complicated, and these are going to continue. So that's what I wanted to end with. So higher ed in most places operates in a 1950s model. Get money from the state, get money from your students. That'll keep your doors open, lights on. It's not true anymore. $0 capital dedicated every year for capital budget at Rutgers. So if there's $0 here, how do you do it? And the answer is P3s. I think, Tony, we're going to be doing this for a while.
Oh, I'm sure we will.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the three key things that make a P3 in my head is risk sharing, and that because there's a longer term partnership, the private entity or the private people help take on some of that risk. Whereas in the old environment, if we were building something, all of the risk is basically on us. Yeah. I mean, the contractor takes some risk, but it's only if they mess up. If there's like a labor shortage or price escalation, that's usually kind of passed on to the owner in the old-fashioned model, where we're using our money to pay for things. But that risk sharing can be transferred much more so in a P3 deal. Project bundling is the second element, where again, it's the private entities could operate the project. Again, in the typical world, they build it for us and they're gone. In the P3 world, they'll operate it. We're in a long-term relationship, whether it's by lease, we might operate it, but there's a longer-term relationship that goes on through the life of the project. Generally, there's some out clauses at times too. And the third one really is, again, access to private capital, where in our old model, we're the ones paying for it, whether we're issuing our own bonds or sometimes we get a little bit of money from the state. But in the P3 world, the privates bring the money. Or tax credits, or some other revenue source that we don't have access, or the land, something that we don't have, and so those are the three key takeaways to keep in your mind about what a P3 really is.